Blessed love and peace. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Allah wabha. Dao ke dao fe chong dao min ke min fe chong min. Ja Rastafari. Deus nos de quies in cele sanctificito nomen tuum. Vahe Guru Sanam. Baruch atah Elohim Eloheinu melech haolam hamotzi lachem min ha'aretz. Amen. Kyrie eleison, sivomas tu savejgatahi, sabe sata babantu sukitata. Fagabiyam. Kwaba upendo na amanim. Fikiri nesinami. Chindadam permer libav me umjaka. Ubuntu shabono fakitka. Session. Kamosanina, no more argato, piluma yellow wakato, toko the wishing Roman God. God, we thank you for all that you bless us. Ata jamia yatafname. Bado, ho, om shanti, shanti, shanti. Amen. This is the rice that I cook for myself. $12 ago. And I'm just having for the first occasion. The sparrows and the flying squirrels say, it's okay. First bites. All thanks and praise. So apparently, when I'm not recording 3-hour vlogs for 3 hours at a time, I'm watching the recordings of 3-hour vlogs for 3 hours at a time, because that's what I just finished doing. I'm not going to record anything this evening. I'm not going to record anything this evening. I can watch something, okay, but before I have a meal. And that's how it starts in the AM in this week. That's notices that, oh, okay, I just finished prayer. Hallelujah. Put on some rice on the stove. Okay, got about 20 minutes. Instead of going to do the work, the assignments that I have to do. Thursday is an off day, but still, like, haven't been doing it too tough this week. Let me just record something. I've been having this thought or whatever. One thing we are thankful for is me being able to maintain the discipline of not going online this week. So we recognize the influence over recent months and even years. So to be able to like start to cultivate or return to this discipline of being offline for durations and having an enhanced concentration, being able to do prayers and meditation and start re-strengthening this discipline and routine, we give thanks for that too. 2 days in a row this week, so hallelujah. So basically, I already said the thing about the question to the Orthodox religious kinfolk. I talked about the mixed heritage. At this point, we're actually one of the immediate projects we're working on is canning vegetables, getting mason jars and canning vegetables, preparing for the winter. Greens, the basics. I mean, I talk about the three sisters, the three brothers, and the three cousins. So along those lines, and then select other vegetables and fruits, and particularly greens, emphatically greens. So we have to do some research. We are connected in communication and relationship with kinfolk who have further knowledge than I personally do about these processes and having equipment in addition. So we're looking at like a gathering of a few days, and all right. Okay. So what am I sharing right now? What was I supposed to share? What am I supposed to share right now? I was watching something that I would talk about, and then I'm reminded about sharing something specifically. Ah, all right, hospitality. This is a topic that's very difficult through the years to find the proper guidance concerning hospitality, particularly the what we can acknowledge as our proper responsibility for providing hospitality. Because when we look at all the different religions of the world, there is a very strong protocol and obligation for people to be extremely um, generous and thorough. Late night. Um, to be very generous and thorough in providing hospitality to others, giving the best of what one has, being very generous and immediate, and make sure people are comfortable. That's with food. That's with the cleanliness of one's habitat. That's with the conversation, and additionally, um, and without it being a question, without it being hesitant or otherwise, a religious practitioner um, is very um, is significantly judged or otherwise by the hospitality the person provides. And then the examples of the leaders and the prophets of religious lineages are cited as being the most generous in hospitality. So as a practitioner, as one's down the line, down the lineage and down the generations, we look up to our prophets and ancestors and sages and say, okay, this is what we're supposed to do. Now that being said, it's a very necessary foundation for having that discipline and that culture. However, then we have these situations where, wait a minute, hold up, what if this person's just mean? Do I have to like invite them into my house and like be generous and give them the best of what we have? Then we get into the finities. We get into the stories from Sikh tradition about Sri Guru Nanak, Sri Guru Gobind Singh Ji disguising himself as a stranger, and all the other households ask him to come back later because it's too early in the AM, except for one person who gives what he has at that moment and then goes and starts to cook something out early in the AM, and then him being celebrated as the one who actually provides proper hospitality that's befitting and expected upon a Sikhi. So that's one example. And there are further examples. Avraham Avinu and his tent and sharing the word of God, inspiring people with his benevolence and righteousness and wisdom, and the hospitality that he and Sarah Imenu provide. So that's high standards. And Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Now Jesus is a flip side because he didn't provide hospitality too tough, aside if you, unless you count the multifolds of baskets of the fish and bread. But other than that, he's the one who's receiving the hospitality. Similarly, the Buddha is the one who's receiving the hospitality. The people are making food for him and filling his beggar's bowl with food. So that's like the uber hospitality, when we are so altruistic that we invite others to have the riches and then solicit people to provide a contribution of generosity or whatever is inspired for nourishment. Um, so there are many different examples, but the basics is like it's high level altruism. Now, when we're in our ordinary state today, or whenever it is that we are, we see conditions and we see how people are cheating and stealing and just trying to get over and just trying to, if we offer this, they're just going to take the whole thing and they're not even going to pause. And in some ways, yes, and so we have to say that, but in some ways, when you offer that generosity and it seems like that person is just going to grab it all and not care, they when they see the honesty within oneself, within the other person, they're like, no, hold on, I don't need all that. I'll just take that. I know that I've lived it, I've experienced it just within recent months of offering things. So I know that level of altruism where we offer everything that we have and it's painful. And kinfolk are like, yeah, no, I don't need all that. Just this right here. Because again, that's when we're living in the truth. We're living in the spirit. Because the spiritual aspirant just lets things go. That being said, everything has a purpose. And when things are put into our possession, or not possession, but things are put into our stewardship, into our care and our protection. Not people, not beings, but materiality. When things, materiality is put into our possession. I said it again. Look at how ingrained that is. Things are put into our stewardship. Ooh, it takes so much work. We have a responsibility to utilize it in a prudent way. So it's not just a matter of giving it to anybody who asks, whatever, because we have to be like, what are they going to use it for? And it's not a matter of being that's where the weight of judgment comes in, where we have to be like, okay, does this person truly need it, or is this person just gonna like pawn it off or like let it go to waste or otherwise? So we have to be prudent in how we distribute it, and that's weighty. It takes our minds off other things, but there's purpose in that. So anyways, point is, focus on concentration. Food. I'm going from spoon to chopsticks to spoon. Did I say that before already? Forks over knives, chopsticks over forks, spoons for all. And everyone in the theater is eating with free hands forever. Popcorn and Twizzlers and pop. Oh my. This is concentrated curry and chili pepper. Voila. Water. All types of examples of and guidance concerning hospitality. But what about when the people are mean? Do we have to invite people who are mean to our house? What if we don't? What if it's not just a matter of us not liking them, but what if we're concerned about them insulting us, insulting our children, insulting our wives, family? Do we have a responsibility? Do we have an obligation, a commandment to let some people in, the enemies, into our own houses? We might say that answer depends upon who you ask. The flying squirrels have just this magnetism. Yo, I'm not a fanboy, but it is impressive. There is a charisma. Yo, there's a charisma. The flying squirrels got charisma. And it's like not even trying. It's not even flex. It's just like, what's going on, Peter? Oh What's going on? What's going on? All right. If you think of it like a chipmunk that just lives in the treetops and jumps and soars from treetop to treetop. If you watch a chipmunk just dart, they don't even like move. Chipmunks like teleport, like Nightcrawler of Marvel Comics. Like boom, 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 boom. That's how fast it is. That's how fast the flying squirrels are, and how rare the flying squirrel. Let's stay on topic. Yeah, okay. I'm going with the spoon because I have to be further exact in moderating the amount of chili and curry on this joint because it gets hot. Ain't cooking too tough, just like putting seasoning on and medicine. But it still has to be palatable and comfortable enough to have a positive experience, a comfortable experience that makes one want to eat again without thinking too much about it. I got manners. To share the line, the classic line of a rather vulgar comedian, adjusted for my personal circumstances. I'm such a fucking gentleman. That's a little bit lowbrow, and maybe we have to be mindful of the hour. But that's old school hood for those that know. I wonder if that's even Google translatable. Oh. So, we're talking about altruism, hospitality, responsibility, obligation. Again, it depends on who you ask. But even then, there's a number of different answers from each person. There's a number of different answers from each person you ask. That spans the range. So even though the answers are different from each person, the range is basically the same. And the range basically goes yes and no, plain and simple. So, yes, there's an obligation to provide hospitality, and no. It's actually comparatively quiet right now, but somebody just dropped a bottle. It didn't break, and it was just not a usual thing, and it's not a positive thing, not a big thing. And then somebody was moving in the direction of the sukkah tent. That doesn't seem too serious at the moment. So, yes and no. Everyone says. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ says yes and no. Jesus says yes and no. Abraham Avinu says yes and no. The Buddha says yes and no. Sri Krishna, yes and no. Lao Tzu, yes and no. We have an obligation to provide hospitality, to be kind, be generous, and be honest with it. And when we do offer something, not to offer our leftovers and not to offer the things that we don't want, to genuinely offer from the benefit of what we have. Doesn't necessarily have to be the best. Like if we're saving, if we've like acquired something that's up for the upcoming ritual that we're not having until we get to that ritual, it's not. There's less of a necessity and obligation of providing it as the first offering to somebody who doesn't know what that is and doesn't appreciate it, whatever else. Because if they did, they'd be like, "No, we got to save that for the ritual. That's not for now." So that's what it is. But if it's a lesser amount or it's a lesser quality whatever that you're saving for yourself, it's like a nice, the a nice loaf of bread or whatever that you're saving for yourself. Yes, that's for the guest. So there are those protocols. However, when there are concerns about a person being disrespectful in somebody's house, a potential of somebody causing harm, or things getting to the point of being disagreeable and otherwise, when a person is known for being abusive, physically abusive, even verbally abusive, there's not a responsibility of inviting that person into one's home, particularly availing oneself, one's family, to those harms and abuses. One is not obligated to provide that hospitality, that invitation, or even that response if somebody asks to visit. Say, no, we're concerned about safety. That's legitimate across the board. And we can look at different examples about scenarios in addition. And that's very difficult for kinfolk like myself who are very ingrained and indoctrinated within this notion of being all giving. And that's a very strong message within Christian ethos of just particularly within those who are lesser learned, of just this imposition and this expectation of just being all loving and just being all giving to the point of being way irrational and otherwise, because that's how generous and loving Jesus is, sacrificing his own life. But in actuality, Jesus does draw limits and does say no to people, and does call people out and even does condemn certain kinfolk to hell. So it's not all peaches and cream, even from Jesus. The Buddha calls kinfolk out. The Buddha doesn't say yes to everybody. The Buddha is rational and isn't this blind altruism of just sacrifice and self annihilation for the sake of somebody else. And it's not even somebody else's well being. It's somebody else's own selfishness or greed or excess or otherwise. Because anything that involves somebody else's sacrifice is not a benefit to the recipient. What about that? Martyrdom? What up? Come on, is that blasphemy? It's a little bit off topic though. But again, we're back to yes and no. There's a yes and no. So I'll specifically talk about Avraham Avinu, and this is some of the narratives that come from the book that I was mentioning just a few minutes ago. Was it still daylight at that time? We can check the record. I do notice that I said, was it yesterday, a couple of days ago, that I was not planning to look at the tape and count actually the minute concerning the situation with the brethren a couple of days ago. And in actuality, I do. I'm not interested in it. I don't want to do that. But I'm called to. And so I do. Like I said, those things, those are joints that are out of my hands. But that's not the topic at the moment. Hospitality. So again, yes and no. And we have to be prudent and reasonable about our generosity and genuineness, and recognize if we have a hesitancy, then we're just like, oh, I don't want to, I don't feel like, I just don't. That's no excuse. And that, if that's the situation, yes, we have to do that. However, if it's a matter of, yeah, I don't know that person, I'm concerned about safety. We have children here, vulnerability. That's a different situation. Particularly in a culture like the United States, recognizing that back in the time of many kinfolk, 100 years ago, thousands of years ago, different time. There were dangers, but it wasn't like city life, particularly here today, or even rural life, when we see like nasty case stories But that's the whole thing. That's a different thing. The point here is to give some scenarios with Avraham Avinu concerning hospitality, where the yeses are like what's obligated and what it was like, and then what some of the contrary examples of non-hospitality, and further. So the basic culture that's attributed to Avraham Avinu is him and Sarah providing very generous hospitality in the dominion of Nimrod. I think it's Babylon. Is it? No. I'll just say in the territory of Nimrod, when he was under persecution. At the same time, he's under persecution because he's inviting people to come and stay with within his dwelling, and teaching them about heaven and God, and further providing very strong hospitality, generous hospitality, nice food, comfortable conditions and everything, and people feeling very comfortable, and in feeling very comfortable, being very inspired by the word, and so going out and just feeling lit, just from the conversation and the reasoning with Avraham Avinu. And that's what the obligation is. That's what the mitzvah is. The commandment to be generous, to provide the teaching, and to provide a comfortable environment where people are further and optimally receptive to hearing the word, are very comfortable. And it's not just a matter of being comfortable and feeling, not a matter of feeling luxurious and pampered or whatever, but it's just a matter of feeling comfortable, because when we're comfortable, we're increasingly receptive to constructive message. Not only that, though, but in the experience of the comfort, there's evidence of the efficacy of what's being taught. When one is teaching in a condition that's uncomfortable, hard chairs or impoverishment or whatever, people, the general natural response is like, that sounds nice, but I'm seeing how you live, and I'm putting two and two together, and that doesn't seem like the most prudent kind of da-da-da-da. So it doesn't have to be like the most luxurious stuff. Obviously, if I'm gonna, my example is gonna be any kind of guidance in that respect. But the comfort does play a role. The food, nourishing food, tasty, yes, but further nourishing, healthy. So the body is experiencing the word. It's through the food. The food is talking loud. The food is talking loud, louder than the words. To be honest. And when people keep down talking, cooking and cleaning, that is actually blasphemy. That's I won't say sacrilegious, but that is so denigrating of cooking and cleaning, and negating and avoiding, ignoring and denying how important and how sacred cooking and cleaning are, because it speaks louder than the words. So that's part of the foundation of hospitality that Avraham Avinu is known for. Excuse me. And then after leaving the territory of Nimrod, and then going on first to Haran, and pausing there for a while, doing the same thing, setting up shop, setting up a homestead, staying with his far, and again providing hospitality. He and Sarai, Imenu. When he continues on to the land of Canaan, at that point, he is a shepherd. He's migrant. He has a tent rather than a permanent dwelling within a city. But still, the premise and the practice of hospitality continues. And so people who are traveling from one place to another, who hear about him, and additionally are motivated to stay and partake of the hospitality that he offers. And that, again, is part of the culture of being shepherds and being in the traveling between towns, and being in the fields and the wilderness. And additionally, there's safety in that hospitality, so there's a pragmatic security concern. But then, don't have to spend your provisions in your travels because somebody's providing. So it's a very strong pragmatic benefit. And at the same time, Instead of just like frivolous, nonsensical talk, now you're hearing about something that's inspiring you, that you can think about, that's giving you food for thought. So when you continue walking on your way, um, you can think about that, and you're open. Like the gates of heaven are open in your mind, and you're thinking further about garden experience and the mathematics of altruism. As you're getting ready for your next trading, your next bartering and trade um, assignment or whatever. So that's part of the nature and the mechanics of the hospitality and the responsibility of the hospitality. Now, all that being said, here's some beneficial things to recognize, and recognizing that there are limits to how much hospitality and how often and in what cases we are called upon to provide hospitality. And again, this is just looking at Abraham Avinu. So one consideration is that even whilst Abraham Avinu is providing this example of adhering to the the mitzvah of providing hospitality, it's beneficial to recognize that even before he does that, he himself is in hiding. So recognizing that he wasn't providing hospitality when he was in hiding, he was hiding from danger, from threats, and so accordingly, when we ourselves are experiencing persecution and things are unstable in our home front, and additionally, there's not the necessity of providing hospitality to the same extent. We have to make sure we are stable and that the environment that we invite people to is secure. So, otherwise, we're inviting people into the block that's hot. So it's beneficial to recognize that and to sober ourselves from that martyristic kind of altruism of like, whatever I have to give. We have to be stable, and that's not a code or a hidden kind of talk for um, um, enriching ourselves and just like that whole game and people. Again, we have to know in our hearts where our levels are and according and appropriately. And yes, even when other kinfolk have a desperate need at this moment, still we have to make sure that what we're offering, and additionally, is stable and is a genuine hospitality, and not just like a desperate measure for kinfolk at that moment, because kinfolk do have immediate needs and genuine immediate needs. However, in just catering and responding to that, um, that has the susceptibility of unraveling one's own circumstances, and that prevents that person from offering that to people later on when a person gets stable accordingly. So that's part of the mindfulness and the prudence of and the responsibility and the commandment of offering hospitality, and recognize it's not just a one-day type of thing, a one-time type of thing. Whilst we have more, there's no guarantee. The storehouse we just filled up, ain't no guarantee we're gonna have it for the next day for ourselves, or that we're gonna be here the next day. So, but at the same time, when we are in the householder mode, we do have to work with certain presumptions and preparations accordingly, and then make it available and offer it to people in a prudent way. Um, so, like in the winter, if it's cold and there's only so much rationed out for the entire winter, it's not a matter of having a big feast for somebody who just comes through and wants to do it. It's a matter of like, yo, this is how much we have. Okay, we'll have to dip in and make adjustments accordingly. But yo, still abide by the common sense, wisdom, and prudence. So, Abraham Avinu was hiding, and so in the hiding did not provide hospitality to Nimrod or anybody who is working on stabilizing us. Now he's actually very young during that time too, but that's one thing. Now again, at some point, Nimrod puts him in the fire on death penalty. He gets out of it, but again, Abraham Avinu is persecuted, and so it's like he has less of a responsibility of inviting the priests or the agents who are doing the persecuting to break bread. Sometimes there is occasion, diplomacy and otherwise, but generally there's not that obligation the same in terms of offering it hospitality to somebody who's just a genuine stranger and otherwise. So when there's persecution, there's less of a responsibility in providing hospitality to the persecution. Yes, we love our enemies. That don't mean we have to open the door and avail ourselves to the sword of enemies and otherwise. We have a responsibility to protect ourselves and to protect the loved ones around us. So again, there's limits to hospitality, and that's not a code word for being greedy and shisty or selfish or stingy, but it's a matter of recognizing there are limits, and that's there's an obligation to limit the hospitality we offer to others, and to know what those limits are, and not just because we feel like it or we don't feel like it or whatever else. So that's one thing. Further, um, hmm, there are a few additional things, a few additional examples. That's that chili pepper working. Ah, okay, I remember one. I think there's something before that one, though. The one I'm remembering now pertains to not losing oneself. Ah, okay, another one pertains to warfare. Okay, so at one point, again, even as an adult, after providing hospitality to kinfolk, there is a warning to Abraham Avinu to leave the area and to find refuge in another place, to hide away from Nimrod, because Nimrod is planning to kill him. Even after the fire, I think it was after the fire situation. Um, so in that guidance, Abraham Avinu and Sarah Imenu are guided to flee, not to provide hospitality, not to welcome the executioners in the door and say, "Oh, hi, let me feed you." Da 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 da. Flee from the persecution and the threats. So again, there's limits to hospitality. And Abraham Avinu and Sarah Imenu, I guess that's Abraham Avinu. To be honest, consider the protocols and when talking about Abraham Avinu and Sarah Imenu before being converted with those names. For the moment, I'm just going to continue saying Abraham and Sarai, Abraham Avinu, Sarai Imenu. So, Abraham Avinu, Sarah Imenu are guided to flee, are told, are directed, are commanded to flee from the threats, not to provide hospitality, not to hunker down and say, "This is the house where I provide. This is God speaks to us here. We're gonna take our stand. Flee from the house, find hiding, seeking from somebody from someplace else, away from the threats from Nimrod." Then, so that's one thing. Self-protection, common sense. It's not some irrational, selfless, self-annihilation, martyristic kind of hospitality or whatever else. And this is not a dig against Christianity. I'm just communicating very practically. There are limits, and we can talk about the examples of Jesus and the teachings of Jesus in the context of this too, or even distinctly. But it's a different framework of working on, and I don't have the notes at the moment. Um, I can speak extemporaneously, but at the moment we're speaking about Abraham Avinu, and whenever we're talking about Jesus, there's the obligation and the proclivity of talking about the Buddha as well, because those are two similar examples that are also have different methodologies that are valuable to look at and study and cultivate within our own discipline. Continuing with Abraham Avinu, though. So when there's persecution, flee. When there's severe threat and persecution, flee. It's not necessary to stay and provide hospitality to the attackers, to the executioners. That's one thing. Now, even when living in another land and getting set up and getting comfortable and getting like a routine going on, having a steady flow of visitors and people like following and ongoing reasonings going on additionally, um, what is communicated is to leave again. Why? Because even though Abraham Avinu and Sarah Imeinu are providing a benevolent service to the kinfolk and encouraging and inspiring kinfolk to think about God and think about altruism and think about fairness and think about honesty and all the virtue within life, at the same time, there's so much corruption around. And what is communicated is that it is necessary to leave this vicinity, to leave the city, to leave that immediate land before it overwhelms Abraham Avinu and Sarah Imeinu. That even though Abraham Avinu and Sarah Imeinu have this tremendous gift and blessing of sharing with others, there's still a susceptibility to being overwhelmed and predominantly influenced by the corruption that surrounds. Eventually, just day after day, month after month, wearing down into just the normalcy of the corruption that surrounds. So instead of doing that, distance, corruption, distancing. So Abraham Avinu does that, and Sarah Imeinu does that. Does that. To retain the knowledge and the wisdom and the discipline amidst pervasive corruption. So again, it's not a matter of providing hospitality. It's not a matter of saying the genuineness and the honesty and the truth within our hospitality will prevail against all the corruption around us. That's hubris right there, yeah? So instead of that methodology, it's like, yo, this is serious, it's overwhelming, it's necessary to go someplace else. So again, we can look into our own experience about the decisions that we make concerning our obligations of hospitality, but then also the reservations and the inclinations towards self-preservation and self-care. It is evident within the ancient teachings of our ancestors, prophets, and sages. So Sarah, Imeinu, and Abraham Avinu are guided to flee from the corruption. Yeah, you're nice. You got skills, you got gifts, you got inspiration, you got the word of God going with you. But you're not all powerful in this earthly realm. And there is a susceptibility towards wearing down to the continual grind of influence and temptation of the corruption that surrounds. So, time to go, time to leave out of that. And Abraham Avinu does. Sarah Imeinu does. With Abraham Avinu. So that's another type of limiting the responsibility or obligation of hospitality. We talk about hiding and not having the responsibility of hosting those who are threatening harm. That's hiding in a cave. That's hiding in another location. And we talk about fleeing, not just a matter of hiding, but fleeing the land itself for concern about not necessarily execution immediately or immediate persecution, but corruption and being eventually thoroughly and unduly influenced by the corruption around oneself. So in that respect, there being a limitation on the obligation of providing hospitality because there's a recognition of the earthly limits. So that's another example of the yes and no and the limits concerning the obligation of providing hospitality. One other example that I share I can be seen falling asleep, but I can still hear. And the further I eat, the further I'm falling asleep, which is actually not bad. It's not a bad hour, but still, it's late to be eating. This is my first solid, proper meal, basically, kind of, sort of today. So I made the rice earlier. which is one of the reasons why I'm eating this late. But I do see myself closing my eyes and starting to like drift off in my blog. So I recapped the different types of hospitality and the limits there. And one other example is this. Later on, when Abraham Avinu and Sarah Imenu are in the land of Canaan and traveling as shepherds, Abraham's nephew Lot is traveling with them with his own entourage or his own camp of shepherds. They separate eventually because there's quarreling between the two camps. There's another example of the limitations of hospitality as it is conferred and conveyed onto the extending infrastructure or organization of Abraham Avinu, his servants. But even further, in the example, the point here is that at some point there's warfare around Abraham Avinu, as he has this obligation of welcoming strangers into his hospitality tent and providing, and additionally, even like again, strangers. We don't know what this person might do. Still, that's very generous hospitality, and it's part of the culture of the environment as well, a culture of the land and time. But then there becomes a point of warfare, and there's kings rebelling against kings, and like it becomes posseing up, and then one side against another. And in that process, Abraham Avinu's nephew Lot is abducted and taken captive. So in response to this, Abraham Avinu organizes his house, his servants, and additionally to engage in the warfare and wage war against one of the sets of kings. So in waging that war, that ain't hospitality. That ain't welcoming kings and saying, hey, let's settle this and have a peaceful court. We advocate that, and that's something that is advocated categorically, but just recognizing them. I won't say this is an example of advocating warfare, but just example, it's a limitation to the obligation of hospitality. So again, there are a number of situations, general situations, just by the example of Abraham Avinu, where when there is persecution, it's okay to flee. It's okay not to invite people and expect to be able to settle it through one's hospitality. It's okay not to do that. When there's concern about being unduly influenced around oneself, having this like a missionary mindset of like our diligence and the honesty within our work will be able to conquer all the corruption around us. And we again be careful of hubris, the pride and ego, even when endeavoring to do something benevolent, being mindful of that and unduly presumptuous of it being able to conquer all the negativity around oneself. And then another example is when conscience is enveloped in violence and bloodshed and warfare, are not reasoning, are not being rational, and are not being righteous, greedy, and otherwise. Then again, there are limits of the obligation of hospitality. The water's a little quick. So those are some of the examples. When there's that conflict, it's unnecessary. Right? Recap again. General categories. When there's threats, unnecessary to provide hospitality. When there's excessive corruption and concerns about being unduly influenced by the corruption, limits on the obligation of hospitality. When there's violence going along and people are engaged in combat, and additionally, unnecessary to provide hospitality. So when we find ourselves in city situations or just any situation within today, and we evidence the different types of behavior around us, yes, there's an ongoing, continual responsibility and obligation to share and to be generous and honest when we share. But at the same time, within certain conditions and circumstances and behavior, there is a further responsibility of tending to our care. I think that's it. So, as I was half sleeping, I was reminded of something else to share. However, at this point, if I can think about it expediently, then I may endeavor to share it. I think just think about another thing. Let's see if I can think about the first thing first. The second thing is about geopolitics. Well, I'll share the geopolitics one, and if I think about the first one, I'll share. If not, we might wrap this up because it is late. It's not that late, but it's still getting late. I'm trying to make this expedient. So here's the second joint, which is actually considered to be shared earlier, but now here it is because there's a lot of things, but I can't share so much. We're not wishing this, not necessarily advocating this. We're communicating this as an observation. There may be some kind of bias within these circumstances, a multitude of biases in a multitude of different ways. We recognize that just by talking about this, in many ways, we are further perpetuating the manifestation of it, and so right there might be perceived as intentionality, but also at the same time, in withholding it, that in other ways further perpetuates its manifestation in perhaps an even inflated and aggravated way, so, or even just a bigger way. So what's the purpose of us sharing this? Amidst that susceptibility of being perceived as a provocateur or provocateurs. Again, this goes to, it's not necessarily world literacy in terms of like history and tradition. It speaks to conditions today. It does speak towards progressions. There's less certainty or absolute kind of conviction from our experience when we convey this. but it does provide a certain insight into the nature of the evolving pluralism of the world, and with that insight, perhaps further skill and amidst all the different susceptibilities of selfishness and greed and manipulation, and everything else, for those who have the inclination of honesty, and additionally utilizing this information and insight in a positive way of preparation and diplomacy, accommodation, and reconciliation, and otherwise. So, all that being said, what we are communicating here is basically a methodology, a scenario, a lightweight scenario, or a mega scenario that perhaps with qualified confidence, or a qualified kind of like confidence is one way to describe it. We're not offering ourselves as prognosticators or prophetic kind of like messenger type situations about future events or otherwise. As I said before, prophecy is speaking about the eternal, and how the eternal continues to unfold. We can talk about progressions. We can talk about pathways, and the observance of pathways, and when pathways intersect or coalesce, like what we can recognize and observe and expect and prepare in that respect. So here's what we observe. We've already talked about like the Black Buddha. We've talked about like the comparative diminution. I keep saying that, trying to say that word, but the comparative reduction or reducing of the status or the leverage um, of Western civilization in geopolitics within approaching generations. Like it's the flows of the rise and falls of civilization. So that's continual. We've already spoken about that as a general kind of framework. One of the things that we've talked about, the East rising, and this is particularly East Asia, China, Japan, Korea, and further. We talked about Buddhism emerging as a predominant methodology of even not necessarily the religiosity, but a certain element of belief, and particularly, and it's like an evolved secularism, an ethical based secularism with spiritual characteristics. Because this is much of the nature of Buddhism, and why it has such an affinity amidst science-minded kinfolk, and that becoming further pervasive as a global norm and pretense for the establishment of political collectives, entire livospheres, entire diasporae of ethnic collectives, even religious collectives of other beings. But just that being a pervasive norm, just like democracy is at this moment, democracy is a religiosity that significantly undermines the traditional religious theologies of Christianity, even though it's born from the Republic experience. Islam has never known anything other than a republic in the like the geopolitical realm, but particularly Judaism, because Judaism does have a history before the existence of the republic, and so. But democracy is the pervasive religion over the past century, particularly, and but there are significant detriments. There are a lot of pluses with that, but there are also detriments, and that's on the wane because the limitations and the the um, the liabilities of democracy are increasingly prominent, and also increasingly known and seen, particularly with the high rates of literacy. That's one of the things that fuels democracy, but at the same time, it also is one of the things that makes democracy less tolerable um, for educated minds that are comparatively or perceivably marginalized or unduly disfranchised. So, all that being said, democracy is comparatively void of a rote, ethocratic or ethical code or ethical code or discipline. So Buddhism provides that without having the authoritarian type of personified subjugation that is present and practiced within Abrahamic traditions. and this is, we're just speaking in terms of world experience and otherwise. So it again is further has a further receptivity and resonance and affinity within the scientific mindset and the secular mindset that has all at this point been accustomed to democracy. And so Buddhism is less of a transition and distinction, or it's an easier transition from the crumbling of democracy at this moment. And the democracy crumbling doesn't mean necessarily absolutely forever, but as a predominant paradigm of governance, that is what is observed in terms of the trajectory. So, for the next few generations at least, and I'm not saying by the way, grace of God, I'm not willing this. We're just observing, and we invite notes, comparing notes, and reasoning respectfully. So we're just observing this. So that's the Buddhist thing. That's not even getting to the point what I'm talking about. So how does that play out? Like, how does that happen? How do these institutions establish or whatever else? So again, the prominence is, well, first I'll talk about the African. Why the Black Buddha? Because even just the Buddha alone doesn't have the foundation of family, of traditional family, and that's still needed. So even though there's this predominance of the secular mindset, there's also a need for the healthy example of traditional family, and something that's part of. And that's difficult to establish exclusively or just with Buddhism as a solitary kind of premise of societal behavior and norms. There's a necessity of some similar balancing, compatible, mutually coexisting, comfortable kind of paradigm and guidance and foundation of traditional family with the Buddhism, without histories of imperialism that need reconciliation and everything else, and honesty and otherwise. And so Rastafari provides that. And so there's a pervasive colorism within the earth. And so there's little expectation of like black being the new imperialism. However, the presence of Afrocentricity within the institutional framework of the different collectives of the global society and the geopolitics and everything is something that is predominant. And so we just communicate at the moment as a society. So at the moment we're focused on Asia. So I guess I just wrap it up with these two things. How long have we been talking? What have we been talking about for the past hour? What's going on? Half asleep, and I've been awake now, but still, like, I'm going on all these different topics because what I'm thinking about, to be honest, right now is like mixed culture missionary work, and like identifying a distinct culture for the omnilateral mixed heritage kinfolk, where people can invest in to establish village and teaching, and those components of it, cough, cough, calendar, the clans, ethics, and the classroom. So song, stories, rituals, ethics. So music, all that. Anyways, that's what I'm thinking about right now, and like notes for that. So as I'm saying that, I'm saying finish this. So basically what we're talking about is this. Two things. Did I move that? I know nobody's coming up here trying to share dinner with me, taking advantage of the dark. There was an occasion a couple years ago, I was laying on the ground, working on the computer, and all of a sudden I just see like nose and whiskers and ears just coming up and just, what you working on? I had the computer, I'm trying to think how I was situated. I might have been on my side, and the computer was on the floor, and I was just doing like typing or whatever, and everything is dark just like right now, and so I'm just looking at the screen, which is not the best for the eyes. And then all of a sudden, like right at the not at the tip of anything here, but right in the crevice, like where the laptop folds, in the middle of the computer, here comes this little mouse, chilling. Like, what's going on, Peter? What's happening? You know, what you working on? There's no food here. There ain't no food here. I was sitting on the ground. I'm like we not cool like this, y'all. And just like seriously, it wasn't some quick investigatory thing, and bounce. It was like, no, what's happening, Peter? No, but what you got going over here though? What's going on? What's happening? This looks interesting, man. What you working on? I heard you got working on stuff. What you working on? Like, no, no, we're not cool like that, y'all. Get on. Oh, what? Huh? Oh, it's like that, Peter? Oh, scurry away. But like, and I feel bad. Like, oh, was I too hard? Was I too strong on that one? Like, the mouse wasn't even like tripping. Like, there was no food there. Whatever there is around, but there's no food there. What's going on? What you doing? Anyway, all right, focus. Let's finish this up. Yeah, okay. All right, so this is what we're talking about. What else I gotta see on this one? I'm trying to think of like if there's anything else aside from what I'm about to say. All right, so we're just gonna keep in mind of like the Afrocentricity that's present in this scenario, but for the moment we're focusing on the Asian component, and actually colorism does factor in it too. So basically, what is observed? Oh, I remember there's something else too about concentration. Haha, how about that? And that might be contrary to what is being observed at the moment. So we got two things to share. Let's finish this up and then share the other one. God willing, come on, let's go. Let's roll, let's roll, let's roll. So what we observe as a scenario is from China, Korea, Japan, predominantly, establishing a very immediate term, micro methodology of forwarding, of migrating kinfolk of Asian ancestry, either directly from China, Korea, Japan, not necessarily limited to these three, but we speak of these three specifically at the moment. Kinfolk, particularly women, young women, and this sounds so like Freudian, like, oh, he's just trying to do something or other. This is what we're observing. And there's further involved into it, but this is what I can speak of at the moment, based on the concentration and everything. Young sistren, particularly like darker skinned Asian sistren, low key, quiet as kept, migrating into the Western Hemisphere, particularly the South, from the land of the Inca to the Guarani, particularly, but even Aztec and Mayan land too, and particularly sharing an Eastern traditional methodologies of healing and fitness. And I mean, this sounds like, oh, you're brilliant. You're saying what the obvious was already happening, but there's further. But just sharing these Eastern methodologies of things that provide immediate benefit that people have a need for, and that come from the East, that are an alternative to the Western methodologies, particularly the strong Christian, Catholic particularly, and oh, wait a minute, oh, here it is, yeah, sour grapes, anti-Catholicism. Everything is manifested for a reason, and everything's simply a progression of revelation and revealing. So kinfolk can take it for what it's worth or otherwise. What I mean by that, by certain pressures, certain intolerances might be the necessary precipitating factor for the revealing of something that has been hesitated upon or withheld or otherwise. So, um, presuming or delving into that presumption of it, some causal factor or causal relationship or a significant causal relationship between what happens this past week and what I'm sharing at the moment. All that being said, everything happens according to the grace of the Most High. So I'm just communicating this, as I said, as a scenario. And even then, I already said before, in terms of like the confidence level, whatever else. And even in Articulate, I've said that there's additional components to this that I abstain from saying at the moment. So I'm just saying this at the moment because this is what I have the capacity to share at this moment. Kinfolk, particularly young Sistren, from East Asia, migrating low-key, whether it's for a specific period or for a longer term, migrating low-key to the area known as Latin America, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, a lot of the major places, major cities, but also Colombia, Venezuela, Peru, Ecuador, and further. And like I said, doing activity like alternative methodologies of healing and fitness, education, meditation, um, therapy, counseling, um, and just these alternative methodologies to the like Western medicine and Catholicism particularly, and darker skin Asian Sisters. So there's a further relatability amidst the colorism within Latin America, and there's a further relationship because there's emphasis in the methodology in relationship with nature. So in doing that, there's a further non-guilt ridden relationship that's encouraged between mixed heritage kinfolk who have indigenous background and value that particularly, and nature, and the relationship with nature as a solution of healing, and additionally, rather than this pervasive trope of conquest and imperialism and all the pollutions that emerge from that. So Asian sister and particularly, but the Asian kinfolk, particularly darker skin, so that there's less of a colorism differentiation between the participants. And there's further resonance and immediacy in terms of the relationship interaction and sharing these methodologies that come from Asia. And through that, there being a wave of like, not like, but a wave of transformation where rather than Catholicism as the pervasive norm and presumption, even within the hierarchies of Latin America, of the southern part of this Western Hemisphere, from Aztec Mayan land to Inca and Guarino, or why I say Guarino now, Guarani, there is an increasing normalization, even within the hierarchy, of the Buddhist secularism that with the attachment to nature and also the brown color relatability. And it's not necessarily Asian kinfolk who are assuming those positions of authority within the hierarchies. But the tradition and the heritage of East Asia, and the Buddha comes from South Asia, but particularly the pathway through East Asia from the Buddha is the foundation for this ascension of another ruling class or otherwise, but institutions emerging, communities emerging, methodologies emerging, where eventually Catholicism is not the norm of Latin America. That seems unfathomable at this moment, but there's just so much unreconciled clapback that's festering, that one of the methodologies of balancing that and actually minimizing that festering clapback is the low-key dissolution of the prominence of the religiosity. So that is one of the considerations. That's one of the scenarios. I have to remember what I was about to say before. Well, one of the considerations with this as an addendum and how this is a further immediate involvement of Africa. I remember now something else I was supposed to say on the topic of Africa. We can go back to chopsticks now. So one, when it comes to Africa and Asia, I mentioned it already before about just because I talk about the ascension of East Asia doesn't mean that it's just some like utopia within East Asia and everything's hunky-dory. There's competition because China is already known as being ascended and having its machine rolling strong at the moment, prominent on the world stage. Do you know how big Japan is? Lightweight with land, but even further by population. And when you recognize that with that significant population, significant advanced technology. Wow. Sizable land, significant population, and highly advanced technology. That's the back of the chair right there. Japan is a latent superpower, world superpower. It's significantly shackled because of the United States and what happens with Pearl Harbor in World War II and like the truce after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. However, that's not a permanent thing. That doesn't last forever. And it's been a while now, almost a century. Not quite, but almost. And so generations pass away, that vitriol, and it is self-protection in certain ways. But again, like the United States was not ignorant of what was being planned additionally, and then leaving Pearl Harbor so vulnerable. We're not going to blame it on the United States particularly or predominantly or otherwise, but again, looking in just the actuality of warfare. It's scripted. Facts. And also, when people talk about how powerful Jews are in terms of conspiracy and everything else like that, people say that the Holocaust didn't exist. Oh, that's what it is. All right, that's just a side note. Okay, that's what people say. We're not saying that, but all right. I'm back on topic. Japan is a latent superpower. It has restrictions concerning the military based upon the negotiated treaty after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But technology-wise, significant, and it doesn't take much. First of all, it's not necessary to have a big war machine in terms of military plans and everything. That's not the nature of warfare today, predominantly. So there's a basic necessity of having a basic kind of like thing going on, particularly for the lower level like factions. But in terms of like superpower status, it's biological warfare, it's technology, satellite infiltration, things like that, assassination, kind of get at kinfolk and use that as leverage for negotiation. That's the type of thing. Identifying, we know where your bunkers are, we know how to get to your bunkers, we know your codes. That's the type of warfare at the superpower level basically. And to be honest, now we're getting into like the spiritual realm too. And now we're seeing this too. This is just shared. So it's evolving. That being said, Japan is in the realm, is at the table, at that seat. Um, may not be a permanent member of the Security Council at the UN. I don't know, but that becomes less relevant. Japan is a latent superpower. Korea is a player, so it still has that involvement, and it has its own wisdom about how to navigate amidst the big ships. So, anyways, and again, I'm just talking about these three at the moment. And it's not a matter of like some prestigious club to be a part of. I'm just talking about conditions. So, within that, dark-skinned Japanese kinfolk, dark-skinned Chinese kinfolk, migrating and ingratiating with Latino kinfolk, sharing these solutions of peace and balance amidst productivity and a very comfortable alternative to Catholicism and even Pentecostalism. Which itself reveals the receptivity that Latino kinfolk have towards a different type of religiosity, to Catholicism. Part of the methodology, or part of the scenario, involves a genuine and nuanced theology that genuinely shares the teachings of Jesus, but does so in a further context, emphasizes ethics, which is what the Buddha is probably distinctive amidst that compared to other traditions, but does so, shares Jesus and teachings of Jesus, in a way that's genuine and compatible with what the norms are, with the expectations and the familiarity is, but at the same time with less of the judgmentalism and the undue burdens of guilt, even perhaps original sin. That, and also the particular emphasis of nature, because that's something that Christianity does not do, particularly in the West, because Christianity in the West is fused with imperialistic conquest, and part of that means or involves being detached from nature, and that's a big thing, particularly recognizing that the vast number of people, particularly in Latin America, are indigenous still, and it's still in the blood, it's still in the bones. The hierarchy is increasingly Eurocentric. However, even within the hierarchy, there's a need for that. So whilst the United States falls apart, dissolves, and is divided up amongst the world powers, and Europe is trying to like stem the damage, because with the fall of the United States, the power of Europe on the world front lessens significantly. Not over, and it's not as devastating to Europe as it is to the United States. Power hegemony, but it's still significant. And so Europe has to like be rather savvy in navigating that process, and particularly not being too obstructive in that process, because the United States has a propensity of just being belligerent and just not acknowledging inevitability. And I don't want to sound too like over the top or whatever, but that's one of the reasons, like I said before, that the United States has little less else to go on than conquest, imperial conquest. It's without some type of native relationship with the land that recognizes, there's something greater than just this conquest stuff. Europe is indigenous and still has that knowledge. So, and also Europe is in Europe, and even though Europe gains tremendously from the United States, particularly England and Britain, still recognizing like you know what, it's not going to be worth us taking a stand with the United States at the cost of alienating the rest of the world and particular parts of the world, and instead of being belligerent obstructionists, like negotiate a process that results in further favorable arrangements for Europe. Um, Looking out for the United States and Americans and making sure things are not too excessive and hurtful and like reactionary, but at the same time, Europe's got to worry about Europe. And in that process, in the dissolution of the United States, Asia rises up considerably, not necessarily absolutely, but considerably and comparatively. And part of the longer term establishment of that ascension is people talk about Africa, and that's true. However, in Latin America particularly, because already religiosity is hollow. Even when people proclaim to do certain things and be certain things, they're not practicing. All love and peace. Love and peace to kinfolk. All kinfolk. We're endeavoring just to be honest. So, and not just honest. The honesty we're talking about is also compassion, because that's an intrinsic part of truth. It's not just a matter of facts. It's a matter of compassion and healing. So I don't mean to sound too flippant or callous or insensitive, and not calling for any demise of any particular religiosity, but just being honest about what the history is, what the track record is, and what the effects of that are, even within the religion itself, and within that, the susceptibilities and the proclivities of change, even significant. Again, Pentecostalism, the revivals out in the woods, and additionally, compared to the structured Catholicism. There's many beautiful things within Catholicism, but there's also a lot of atrocities too, and a lot of disassociation with nature, a lot of disassociation with traditional family, and a lot of guilt and burdens as a methodology of behavioral control and support. So that's methodology. And there are a lot of other details and other components of it, but one thing to share though is, as I've talked about before recently, is that I'm talking so much this week. As I talked about the ascension of Asia, it's not an absolute ascension. There's India too. And one of the other things about East Asia of mindfulness is that there's competition even within East Asia. It's not necessarily some cooperative Asian Union type of situation. Could be. But even within that scenario, just because this is the nature of it, there's competition of Japan wanting to be greater than China, China wanting to be greater than Japan, feeling the need of being greater than each other. And so even when employing similar tendencies and If one asks the Chinese embassy or Ministry of Foreign Affairs for China about intentions of clandestine infiltration of Latin society and hierarchies through the introduction of Asian sistren of dark complexion, that's malarkey sounding. Um, so, anyways, um, point here is that there's still contention, there's competition between China and Japan, and also Europe. I mean, also Korea. Interesting that. Also Korea, in navigating those two big ships, but particularly recognizing that Japan is a latent superpower, um, and its ascension, and in through its ascension, the particular pronounced establishment of East Asia uh, as a dominant world political presence in ongoing generations. Now, within that, in the competition between China and Japan, as well as Korea and otherwise, it's a matter of which methodology, which which nation is able to, or which geographic location is able to implement a further effective methodology of post-imperialism or otherwise, in terms of like the doctrine that is shared, um, and the process and implementation, whether it's a Chinese methodology or whether it's a Japanese methodology or whether it's a Korean methodology or otherwise. And that is influenced by Latin America, obviously, but it's also influenced by Africa and other regions of the world. And so that's part of the ongoing relevance and influence of Africa, because that stands a significant um, that stands as a significant determining factor in the relationship and the competitive relationship between Japan and China, particularly amidst the actualization of Japan as a superpower. And amidst a lot of the space opening up with the dissolution of the United States. And the question in that respect, as I said before, is this: who treats Africans better? And again, those who have the intellectual stamina can just reduce this to just some, oh, this is just some um, convoluted, selfish, biased, mumbo jumbo ramblings. We invite kinfolk to do and share better. And continuing on, the question is, who treats Africa better? Who treats Africans better? Chinese, Korean, or Japanese, particularly. There's already the presumption that Africans are treated better in Thailand and Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia and even perhaps Singapore. Why? Because those kinfolk are further darker skinned and get hate and colorism from China, Korea, and Japan already. So it may not be very much, but still, it's like we already know how the game works. Malaysia too. Doesn't mean like Vietnam is saying, "Hey, Africans, brethren, come over," but still, compared to like China saying, "Yo, you can't eat here," and NIIGGA. Anyway, all right. Who loves and supports Africans better? We get into that Jerry Maguire movie. I love African people. Who does it better? Who does it further honest? Who does it further pervasively, genuinely, perseveringly? Gambaru. What shu. So that is a prominent question in the unfolding of this process. Which collective provides further genuine is further genuine. How about that? With Africa. Um, so, such an ingenious, contrived carrot and stick theology. So there's that. Actually, two things to think about, or two things to share. One in terms of concentration, the other in terms of Africa. So we'll continue on with Africa because of the continuity. So I watched a video recently about the conference of African football. And in that commercial, actually, the first time I saw it, I thought it was like I was trying to download highlights of the tournament, and it was basically just a promo ad. Again, oftentimes I'm outside doing Wi-Fi and downloading like initial responses or initial results from search terms without looking at all of it all the way through. So when I first looking at this, thinking like it's gonna be highlights and just see what's going on with the African Confederation, and it turns out to be a promo for a tournament. And in that promo, it's in English, and it's giving this like message of a Pan-African kind of experience. And so it's talking about in kind of some like nostalgic kind of way with African writers, talking about African culture and peoples from all over the continent of Africa getting together for this tournament, and it being a symbol of African solidarity. There was something that was referenced specifically, and it was a little bit like, that's not it, y'all. But there was a signal. Oh yeah, wow, this is what it said, and it was difficult for me to this moment to think of something contrary to like counter argue that. But basically, what was proclaimed in this promotion was that calling the African Cup the greatest collective gathering of Africans on African soil. And I was like, wait, this football. And football, that's so imperialism. FIFA and all the different confederations, that's so imperialistic. So to call an imperialistically administrated tournament as the greatest gathering of Africans in Africa, it's like, oh, but then again, on the flip side, can you think of one greater that exists at the moment? And we have to go traditionally to like be substance in responding to that. But when we do that, then we recognize, well, that's not all Africa. So that's on Africa. That's on us. So that being said, the rest of the commercial is just the promotional is just like a number of different narrators, presumably narrating a speech or an address from a number of different African writers who are solicited to give some kind of introduction to this tournament. And the basic theme from all the writers is like this notion of unity amongst Africans and the tradition and the different basic components of the sport of football. And the thing about it is that it's coming from it's portraying a perspective of Pan-Africanism, where and in that notion of collective oneness, that many of the people who are proclaiming that are actually at the moment living outside of Africa, whether it's in East Asia, Japan, China, Korea, or whether it's in the Western Hemisphere in terms of the United States, Canada, or no, excuse me, I'm falling asleep again, or it's in Europe, and like a city in Europe, so that by the message is that even kinfolk who are isolated by themselves in the cold climate of cold cities of Europe still can participate and be part of the fold, particularly during this African Confederation Cup, African Cup. The specific title escapes me at the moment. So, but that's the basic gist of the promo. And the thing about it is that they're showing people, as I recall, generally they're showing people from different scenarios of different regions. Africans, one studying and like being a student in another land, another one being like a business person in another land. And so again, even though people aren't on the continent or whatever, here's an opportunity to connect with everybody in a meaningful way through the guise of the sport of football. But everybody gets together. It's a Pan African thing, and I mean, it's a little bit over the top, to be honest. But I mean, for a commercial from an imperialist kind of thing, it's okay. Well, I can't even say it's okay, but I mean, it does its thing or whatever. Now that being said, what becomes very difficult to very difficult to reconcile once it's recognized is this: in the entirety of that promo, and additionally, there was like no hint of reference or naming or speaking to the experience of people of African ancestry in the United States. Over 30 million, 50 million, however many we got, kinfolk. And so immediately I'm already on the tip of like Africa. Don't we could talk about reparations, that's one thing, but and even that's just a limited stopgap measure type of thing. So that's not even the goal. And we can talk about I said reparations, repatriation, and all these other things about what other people should do for people of African ancestry in this from the Middle Passage. What's talked about less is how much Africa should do and has an onus of doing for people of African ancestry who are descendants of those who go through the Middle Passage, and how politically incorrect that is to even talk about in many of the forms of the world. But it's significant, and I've continued to advocate that and articulate that. So that being said, and recognizing there's still a lot of healing to be done between the children of Africa who are on this continent, not just in the United States, but in the Western Hemisphere, and the African continent, and how the African continent has yet to properly account for the atrocities that it does to the children of Africa in betraying us, sending us out, and additionally. And we're not putting it all on African kinfolk, but again, particularly given how much kinfolk of African ancestry on this hemisphere have done for the well-being and the benefit of kinfolk on the continent. We're family, and it does what we do, but at the same time, there's been very little on the flip side in terms of protecting the well-being, offering home and sanctuary for African kinfolk on the continent and otherwise. So there's a lot that Africa has to do to step up its game in its relationship with people of African ancestry who've gone through the Middle Passage. A lot for Africa to do. I continue to say it. I say that for years. And that's not shade. That's not hate. That's facts. That's facts. So, all right. Now that being said, when I see that commercial, still love Africa. I like the African Cup and everything. That we're kinfolk. Africa shows me love, thorough, spiritual awakening, thorough. So we still have to hold accountable. If we expect anybody to be accountable, we have to hold ourselves accountable. Am I speaking the first person just for Africa and otherwise? Get over it. European brethren, we have to step up. How about that? So anyways, wada. Point here is that when I see that commercial and I have that mindset of like the relationship between Africa and the Middle kinfolk, and I see the Middle Passage kinfolk, and I see no representation of Middle Passage kinfolk being included within the commercial. So when people are talking about this solidarity of oneness and everything else like that, and showing the different signs of being in Europe and Asia, and not including the Western Hemisphere, particularly the United States, because that's the loudest, but even like, you're talking about football, you're not like talking about Brazil. What's going on? Now there might be scenes of that fame that, but definitely there was like no feel of the United States, and kinfolk in the United States. And so when I think about that, I'm like, yo, that's messed up and everything else like that. But then I have to pause a second, and I have to like check myself and recognize that amidst all the indiscretions and everything else, in that scenario on the part of the Confederation and whatever tournament that is specifically in the organizers of that promo, regardless of all that, the actuality is that there's legitimacy in not catering to black folk in the United States, because by and large, black African kinfolk in the United States don't mess with the sport of football too tough. So when the African Confederation is organizing a commercial to promote the event in a brief period of time, there can be the PC thing of including people of African ancestry in the United States into the promo specifically, but at the same time, it may take on an air of contrivedness when there's so much scrutiny about who is assigned a page and otherwise. Anyways, point being is that the question was, why should the African Confederation Cup make an effort of promoting a sport? Because that's the purpose of the commercial, presumably, is to promote the sport. Why would Africa make that effort of specifically including kinfolk from the United States? Let's just talk about the United States specifically, regardless of how nice they are and whatever leagues they are. And additionally, the actuality is starting to fall asleep. The actuality is that people in the United States, African kinfolk in the United States, have yet to catch on to the sport of football. So it would be like making this huge effort of inclusion at the cost of high scrutiny from other kinfolk in the Pan-African diaspora. Like, why are you putting so much love on the United States when they don't even watch football? Who are you working for? Type of situation. So, I have to check myself because, the American kinfolk, African kinfolk in America don't watch football too tough to be able to back up and like legitimate and substantiate the concerns of including people of the Middle Passage in the messaging of the promo and otherwise, because of that relevance, yet that being tempered by the actuality that people of African ancestry don't support the sport that tough. And so there's little reason for any nation or the Confederation as a whole to make a concerted effort to include African kinfolk in the commercial when African kinfolk in the United States aren't even supporting the sport. So things change even within a generation, but at the moment, even just that's what is observed. So I'm falling asleep now, and we're getting into the midnight itchy thing. So our eyes are strained watching a screen at dark. So, anyways, that was the pause concerning African trade. I've been falling asleep that whole time. If you can't tell, my eyes closing and everything. I'm sleep talking. Bingo. So, point here is for black people in the United States, get on to football, so that there's a legitimate seat at the table in Pan-Africanism, because kinfolk are being left out, and that's significant. That's a significant liability, because the game today involves leverage outside of the plantation, and establishing that leverage outside the plantation involves a literacy in what other people are doing, even just other people in Africa are doing, have an interest in. Football is a very accessible medium of establishing that relationship. So without that, kinfolk are severely leveraged on a domestic front or in a domestic confines of the plantation. So that's what's frustrating, that Africa was excluding Middle Passage kinfolk from that commercial, but at the same time it was difficult to advocate for middle class or for Middle Passage kinfolk to be included in that commercial, because Middle Passage kinfolk by and large have yet to get on to the join of world football. So that's that. Now, that being said, the final thing I say, because I gotta wrap this up, I'm falling asleep, y'all. How many 2-hour joints do we do in a week? I haven't even been doing my deep dives like I was planning to. How about that? Distraction and otherwise, So, been doing deep dives into just like the general mix. what I'm about to say just might sound so funny and ridiculous, but I'll say it. Now, with all this past few minutes in consideration and all the challenges of this past week in consideration concerning my personal concentration and everything else like that, we still observe that there's a pervasive decrease of the integrity of concentration around us, and that's a challenging experience. And yet, rather than admonishing people or just finding that as an opportunity to vilify people and devalue or subjugate or otherwise, to recognize that when we do have the ability to maintain concentration, to keep a thought and a train of a stream of mind, a train of thought, that is a tremendous gift that has tremendous responsibility. Just the ability to concentrate and think straight when a lot of people are distracted. It's not just an opportunity for economics or whatever else. It's a it's a spiritual responsibility, and it's beneficial to respect that and discern the methodologies of honing it and sharing it. So just talking about the ability to concentrate, how valuable that is across society, how increasingly valuable it is in recent years and experiences, and how the responsibilities that exist within a concentrated mind. One way I liken this is the metaphor. A TV show back in the day, like 20 years ago, after the 11th of September. I think it was called The Event. I've talked about this before. It was kind of it was actually like a mainstream sci-fi kind of thing, but it was like a dystopian or quasi, before the realm or the genre of dystopia was around. It was along those lines, kind of, sort of. But basically, this is what it was. One day, around the world, at a specific time, all around the world, the same time, even though it was different hours, it was the same time around all the world, simultaneously, nearly everybody around the world falls asleep. Just goes unconscious. They might have been sitting at home watching TV. Then they might have been driving a bus or piloting an airplane or otherwise, but everybody, 99.99999% of the people on Earth lost consciousness for a period of like 90 seconds. And there were crashes, people died, some people just trippy or anything, but everybody falls asleep. Virtually everybody falls asleep 90 seconds. Then after that 90 seconds, people wake up and are like, yo, what was that? What happened? Did you do that? I mean, did you feel that? Did that happen to you? Oh yeah, I felt that. What about you? Yeah. So then that's what the TV show is based upon. It's like the aftermath of that, trying to figure out what happened, what its implications. Was this some kind of like sophisticated, high-tech mind control kind of apparatus that was just flexed, like a world concentration bomb where everybody just loses consciousness? So the main characters of this TV program are like federal agents who are investigating it, and they have to go the mid-level mystery and everything else like that is that part of it is that when everybody was unconscious, almost everybody, the vast majority of people, have a dream. Everybody has a different dream, but it was a very vivid dream that everybody remembers, or almost everybody remembers. And again, everybody's dream is different according to their own life and experience, but there was something that was in common with everybody's dream, which is that there was a specific time and day, or at least a specific day. I think it was a day and time that communicated that the dream was indicating a future experience at that day and time, like a number of years later or something like that. 2 years from now, 3 years from now, on this day time, this is what you're doing. And so, and it would be like their future life in the next 2 years or whatever, 3 years. And so it was a very vivid, like it felt actual life. So when people woke up, again, what was going on? And then, I'm having this, whatever. So that's the show. And now from that, everybody's going to try to take advantage, and now gangsters are doing their thing, and corporations doing their thing, and the government has to investigate who did that, this and the other. Again, this is an old school thing when we were still kind of that scenario. So that's who the main characters are. They're like federal agents who are investigating what happened, and what was the intention and everything else like that. Because it seems like it's something that was like man-made or whatever. Excuse me. So one of the federal agents. So in that story, I said most of the people had that dream. Each one's dream was different according to their life, but the day and time was the same for everybody who had that dream. Now that's the vast majority of people. Some people didn't have a dream at all. What does that mean? 2-3 years from now? I didn't have a dream about that. Ooh. So now people are freaking out about that. For those who had no dream. It's like, and there were like cults that form overnight about like nihilism, like, we're gonna die anyways, might as well just like live it up, don't give a fuck anyways, the world is shot to blah blah blah. Nobody knows what's going on, and if it could happen again or otherwise. So there was like this underworld culture, where only people who didn't have a dream can participate. And it was, again, like sex orgies and all types of indulgence and hedonism, because bump it, we all know what's going to happen. We all know what that means, supposedly. And now might as well just do what we want to do, because we don't know what's going to happen. So that was one part of it. Now there's another interesting part of it as well, which is this. When the government agents are doing this investigation and retrieving security recordings, because the technology was still going at the same time when everybody was asleep. So they're looking at security cameras and just trying to figure out what happened. Was this all over? Was there any exception, any geographic exception or otherwise? And then so in re-looking at all the file tape and everything from that day when everybody falls asleep, the agents eventually find that they're looking at this security film from a sports stadium that's filled with people when it actually happens. Might have been a baseball game. And so in this sports stadium, of tens of thousands of people, 100,000 people, filled, packed, a match in process, in progress. But at a certain point, when everything goes down, everybody in the stadium falls asleep. But the security camera shows one person walking around, checking around to see if anybody else is there, and knowing, they walking around they know what's going on, but they're concerned if there's somebody else in their midst. And additionally, and so who is that? Why aren't they knocked out? What are they looking for? What are they doing there? And there were a number of footages like that, of these mysterious individuals who were still awake when everybody else was knocked out. How is that? How could that be? Are these aliens? Is this do these people have the technology antidote to some kind of mind wave apparatus? So anyways, that's part of the TV show. Now, that was on mainstream TV 20 years ago, right after the 11th of September, which is very interesting to see that type of topic and vulnerability on the part of TV. But at that moment, the internet was still on the rise. So maybe TV was it was still, TV was still the thing at that point, but whatever. will do something risque just to get numbers. They are dropping like hotcakes. That's not the saying, but that was an interesting thing. I think again it was called The Event. So what we observe is that with the internet, it's not necessarily a momentary kind of event, a single anecdotal event, but what we're observing is something similar, of just a gradual takeover of people's concentration, so that there's an increasing value to be in the presence of somebody who has heightened concentration and can and share that with others. The consequences of that, though, is being increasingly beholden or influenced by that person who provides that concentration. So it's a matter of finding somebody who has an agreeable life disposition in terms of behavior and beliefs and otherwise. So there's that. Is that all the point for concerning concentration? I already talked about having heightened responsibility, so I think that's going to be what I share at this moment. Again, I'm thinking about, to be honest, the mixed heritage missionary thing, and who might be further motivated to get involved, to participate, to contribute, and to help organize and otherwise. I'm gonna wrap it up here. I'm gonna continue eating and then work on notes, to be honest. A little bit late to start this at the moment, but that's how we began this joint over 2 hours ago. So congratulations. Further. We give all thanks and praise to the Most High. All thanks and praise to the Most High. Blessed love and peace in Rastafari.